Retirement with Bill Geiger of Geiger Wealth.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. The future is female and she's furious. This compelling column by Cathy Young, who's a associate editor at Arc Digital, contributing editor for Reason. She has written a book called Ceasefire, Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality. The piece I'm referring to, The Future is Female and She's Furious, I tweeted out. You can find it at reason.com as well. In her closing paragraph, she writes, the anger of, quote-unquote, white men in the Rust Belt is commonly portrayed as an unfocused, dangerous emotion that scapegoats innocence and empowers unprincipled demagogues like Trump. The anger of privileged women is not much of an improvement. The anger we see from your pea-hat friends and suburban dilettantes. Yeah, what about that? Pleased to be joined by Cathy Young. Cathy, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning.
Good morning. The future is female, and she's furious. And if you look at the leadership of the Democratic Party, at least where the energy is, the youth of the Democratic Party, also decidedly anti-Semitic, we're finding out, too.
Well, yeah, this is a new sort of issue that is genuinely causing some rifts because it does kind of clash with a lot of the more traditional constituencies of the Democratic Party. So, yeah, I mean, this has caused a lot of dissension in the Women's March already. So I think this is definitely something that we'll be seeing more of. And, of course, now there's also a clash over this between Nancy Pelosi, who also represents kind of older generation of Democratic leadership, and some of the younger, kind of more radical members. So yeah, this is going to be a kind of interesting time because I think it's been predicted a lot that this sort of wave of female activism is going to really sort of usher in this new Democratic-led era. And I think we're now seeing that it's not going to be as smooth and filled with solidarity and, sisterhood as has been predicted.
I mean, speaking of radicalized congresswomen, what do you think of Rep. Omar of Minnesota, her apologizing for the tweets that she put out that many considered anti-Semitic?
Some of the tweets.
I should note that it's really not the first time that she has been in trouble over a tweet that many said was anti-Semitic. There was another one when she was a state legislator when she talked about Israel having hypnotized the world, which many people considered to be, and I think not unfairly, to be kind of replicating this anti-Semitic kind of trope of, the Jewish conspiracy and so on. Yeah, I mean, the apology, I honestly wasn't too impressed by it for two reasons. One is that if you look at the apology, in the apology itself, she says something about how, this is just as hurtful as when people have insulted me based on my identity. I kind of think that when you're apologizing for something, it's really not a good idea to, in the same breath, say that, this is really just as bad as when people were mean to me.
Right.
I mean, that to me doesn't speak of a very sincere apology. And the other thing that is also very suspicious is that I think literally moments after she put out the apology, she retweeted a thread by a progressive activist, basically talking about how it's really terribly unfair to attack, Representative Omar as anti-Semitic. The real anti-Semites are all on the right. And talking about how, yes, this pro-Israel money really is a terrible thing in politics. And by the way, the claims in that thread are being questioned now. But that's sort of beside the point. I mean, I just think when you apologize under pressure, and then immediately put out a tweet or retweet a thread that talks about how it's really terrible that you're under pressure over this, that really does undercut the validity of the apology. So I think she kind of put her foot in it. I think she really did not handle this very well, and I think this controversy is really not over. So we'll be seeing more of that, I think.
Going back to men and women and getting along and all of that good stuff. Is it a situation where, what we see in media and in larger culture is not necessarily reflective of the lives that most people live? In other words, most people don't have racial incidents on a daily basis. They get along with other races quite fine. Most men get along with women on a daily basis quite fine. There's certainly exceptions to that, but it's not it's not omnipresent like it's portrayed.
Yeah. I remember that when the Brett Kavanaugh hearings were going on, and when Christine Blasey Ford testified, I remember seeing this headline in the New York Times that said something like, across America, women are reacting to the Christine Blasey Ford's testimony with, rage and tears and so on. And, as it happens, on that day, I was going around doing some errands, and, I was looking around, and there were lots of women. And you know what? I didn't see anyone showing any rage or shedding any tears. I think on that day I actually went with my mom to a doctor's appointment, and there were mostly women in the waiting room, watching TV. And you know what? I didn't really see anyone getting terribly upset. So, I think that there definitely was a kind of subset of women, I think, for whom this was a deeply enraging experience. And, I don't really mean to put down the experience of any actual victims of sexual assault who, could relate to Christine Blasey Ford, leaving aside the question of how accurate her story was, which I'm not really making any pronouncement on. But, but that's, I really think to say that this is like women across America, that's really a pretty small minority of women. So,
right.
I think to generalize about this wave of female rage, I think is very inaccurate.
But here's the thing, though. Here's what I see happening, and see if you agree with me. So, right, it's not accurate. It's hyperbolic, but it's hyperbolic for a purpose. And one example of the purpose is what's happening on college campuses. The other is what's happening in corporate boardrooms. And I note this letter that was circulating among a couple hundred general counsels of big corporations. They sent to big blue chip law firms and basically said, you don't have enough minorities and women in your partner group, and we're not going to do business with you until you do. And so it's
really?
It's it's using identity politics very specifically and surgically to take over institutions, even if you're not, convincing the majority of the population that they should be at war with somebody because they're a woman or because they're of a different race.
Right. Yeah, and, I want to say, on a certain level, I don't have any problem with, making an effort to reach out and, bring more, a more sort of diverse cast of people into various institutions. I think it all really depends on how you're doing it. But yeah, I certainly agree that the push that we're seeing now, it's not just a push to bring in, a more diverse cast of people. It's a push to bring in a cast of people who all share a certain kind of politics. And I think that's really where the kind of the crux of the problem is. It's diversity, sort of in the sense that you have a lot of people who look different, but they all think alike. So I think that's the real issue here, and I think that's something that we definitely need to be wary of. Because I can tell you that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that this idea of diversity and bringing in more women and people of color, that doesn't include someone like Nikki Haley,
right,
who
exactly.
is both a woman and a minority. So, but that's definitely, it's not for her.
What did you think visually, and what effect it had on you during this president's State of the Union address when all the women wore the white suffragette outfits?
I didn't really have any issue with that. I mean, I think it was kind of interesting that the most interesting moment to me was when Trump actually mentioned this record number of women who were now in Congress, and they all applauded, which was, I mean, it's kind of a surreal moment because, first of all, like, he is complimenting this group of people who, most of whom came into Congress specifically on the wave of, the anti-Trump resistance.
And then they complimented themselves. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
and then they're complimenting themselves, and they're applauding this guy who is really, according to them, like Hitler. And I mean, believe me, I'm no Trump fan, but I mean, I do think that some of the rhetoric is pretty excessive. I mean, I will say that without lapsing into identity politics, I think it is worrying that we're now seeing this sort of gender polarization along partisan lines, where there's actually been a drop in some ways in the representation of Republican women. And it's not so much of a gender gap in the population, but even if you look at state representatives, it's much more even-handed. But in Congress, I'm not going to throw the numbers at you because I don't remember them off the top of my head. But it's just really a very stark kind of like almost. Grand Canyon-sized balance, really, between Republican and Democratic women in Congress, and that I think is really not healthy. And it's not something that we've always seen historically, because if you look at 20, 30 years ago, for instance, in the Senate, there were actually more Republican women than Democratic women, and even in Congress, it was pretty even-handed. So I mean, I think this is something that
recently.
We can legitimately be worried about without necessarily playing identity politics. But I mean, the fact that that Democratic, the sort of female vanguard of Democratic politics is very heavily into sort of identity politics is also worrying. And, it is going to cause, as we're already seeing with Ilhan Omar, it's going to cause more problems. I mean, I think we're seeing clashes over, Me Too issues with, Kirsten Gillibrand getting a certain amount of backlash over her, pushing Al Franken, pushing Al Franken off the boat, so to speak. So, it's definitely going to be conflicted. So I think. This is really not a very good prescription for political action.
She is Cathy Young. She's a associate editor for Arc Digital, contributing editor at reason.com. Her column is "The Future is Female," and she's furious. Book on the topic as well. Ceasefire: Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality. Cathy, thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.